Hello, welcome to the Google Hangout for the Millennium Development Goal 2 discussion about girls' education in developing countries. I'm Lindsay Schreier. I'm from Quincy, Massachusetts. I'm a freshman at Boston College and a teen advisor for Girl Up, a United Nations Foundation campaign for girls' education in the developing world. I'm also going to be moderating this panel today. I think we'll have everyone introduce themselves now.
Hi, I'm Sarah Brown. I'm the co-founder of A World at School, and I'm the executive chair of the Global Business Coalition for Education.
And Sarah Brown is only going to be with us for the first 15 minutes of the call, so we're going to be directing our questions towards her while she's here, and then afterwards we'll open up the panel to everyone. So one of the first questions that we had today was how does gender inequality affect education, and what are some of the barriers that girls are facing in education?
I suspect with people logging onto the Hangout today that everyone will be aware that there's a huge inequality there and that girls face many disadvantages. I think what's interesting over the last 10 years or so is the shift is not so, there have been changes. We've got more girls into school, but the big challenge now is how we make sure that two things really. One, those girls that are still not in school, we get into school, but there are the same numbers girls and boys who are out of school. But the huge challenge we really have to overcome is once those girls are in school, how they have the opportunity to stay in school and to learn and to thrive and to have the same opportunities that boys face too. And you asked about the barriers. The very obvious barriers that we know we can single out and do something about is facing square onto the issue of child marriage and the damage that does to girls, seeing them married off so young in their early teens and losing out on their opportunity to be at school. And then issues around young girls working and being carers in their families and how that denies them the opportunity to be at school.
So right now we have 500 days until the Millennium Development Goals we're supposed to be have made considerable progress on. So I was wondering, how do you think that Millennium Development Goal 2 has progressed since they've started working on the Millennium Development Goals?
You coming to me again, Lindsay?
So we've been working on the Millennium Development Goals for the past 15 years, and it's almost getting close to the time that we are supposed to have seen some considerable progress on the Millennium Development Goals. And I was wondering, what progress do you think has been made towards Millennium Development Goal 2?
Well, I think the 500 days really gives us pause for thought, and I think it's a moment where we're all coming together around all the Millennium Development Goals. But I believe very passionately that unless we're doing something about that education goal to really reach those last 58 million children who are missing out and really look at how we overcome the extra barriers for girls, that we're not really going to have the greatest impact on all those other goals around health and nutrition and equality itself. So there has been massive progress. We know there's been massive progress. We started off with an out-of-school figure at the start of the Millennium Goals of well in excess of 100 million children. But we're not making progress fast enough. And 500 days is a scary number because it gives us about a year and a half to try and get many millions of children into school and many millions of girls the opportunity to be able to stay and learn.
How does A World at School work to address the problems that girls are facing in education?
Well, we believe that there are many fantastic organizations, NGOs, government programs who are running fantastic programs on the ground, that when you connect up, you can see where teachers are being trained, classrooms are being built, educational supplies are being facilitated. But one of the big challenges is making sure that the advocacy is there, that where we need to use our voices to be able to reach political leaders and see them take the decisions that can literally overnight with one decision that a head of a country can make, working with their finance minister and their education minister, can transform what happens for so many girls. So what A World at School is doing is acting as a hub to engage with so many of those brilliant organizations, large and small, and individual campaigners, to make sure that when we bring our voices together, we absolutely make sure the people we're trying to reach can hear us loud and clear.
Okay. So now that we are getting close to the 500 days, what do you think we should work on in the post-2015 Millennium Development Goal, the post-2015 agenda after the Millennium Development Goals?
First of all, I don't think we should give up on the Millennium Development Goals until we've absolutely worked hard to meet the promises we've already made. I passionately believe that if as a world we came together and made promises, any commitment we make post-2015 isn't going to add up to much if we couldn't make the first round of promises count for something. So I think we mustn't lose sight of the fact that we've made very, very strong commitments, and for education, we promised that we would get every child, every boy and girl into school. Post-2015, we can start to expand that and make sure that children are getting higher quality of learning, that they're also not being denied the opportunity because of the barriers they're facing around the issues like child labor, children being caught up in conflict. Some of our solutions now need to be quite sophisticated because we need to connect in to what's happening on the ground if a country is facing huge unrest or facing conflict or the aftermath of conflict. But the basics are simple, and we mustn't lose sight of the fact that those promises start today. So of course we keep shaping and improving what we're doing, but our goal is to have every child in school.
How do we make sure that education is a priority in the 2015 agenda? How do we make sure that countries reaffirm their commitment towards working towards achieving primary education for everyone?
Well, right now we can speak to country leaders all the time. I don't think there's a single leader of a country that runs in an election that doesn't put education on their manifesto. I don't think there is a single political leader that would say that education doesn't matter to them, or they don't think of it as something that they would share with an electorate when they're running for office. So that's our great opportunity to keep every leader listening and hold them all to account, which is why, as vital as it is to have amazing programs that run on the ground, we also each need to take that time to join together to create the loudest volume of noise that we can. And the asks that we're making right now is to create school places, to be able to think through the planning for what delivers those school places, and more than that, to make sure that girls are not left out of school because something within their own family is preventing them from being able to go. And also when they get to go to school, that school is safe for them. I think we've seen some heartbreaking tragedies this year that have really given us pause for thought. But truthfully, this is going on all the time in many countries where schools are not safe for girls to be at. So again, the advocacy piece is really, really important, and how we stand up and shout out. But I think we've noticed that many, many millions of people around the world care so much about this, and have been prepared to give over all of their voices, attending vigils, using their social media reach. And you can see that political leaders are hearing it and are noticing the calls.
How does investing in a girl help the society in which she lives and the world as a whole?
Well, I know that some of the other speakers on the panel will be able to answer this in much greater detail, but I think just from my point of view, and to just say this quickly, that we know that to invest in a girl gives her the opportunity that she deserves as an individual. But more than that, she then grows up to be a young woman who gives back so much to her family and to her future family with her own children and to her community at large. And I know there are many fantastic stats around this where, and I think my favorite is the one where we say where for every year of schooling that a girl gets, that ups the amount of income she will have by about 10% each single year, which I think is a astonishing set of figures, really.
Okay. I'd also like to hear from some other members of the panel. Maybe Christy, would you like to talk about what you think that the world would be like if more girls were empowered through education? And also introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Christy Vilsack. I'm the Senior Advisor for International Education at the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. Certainly the world would be a better place if girls had an education because we would have leaders, more leaders working at the community level and certainly at the national level all over the world to make sure that girls had equal opportunity. So absolutely, and all of the issues that we're all working on can really change that. And I think because we have a lot of young people listening in and participating in this today, it's really important for young people to realize whether you're old enough to vote or have a voice in government, that you still have the opportunity to influence people in your families and people in your communities to make sure that those people who do have the opportunity to make policy can make good policy because you have made your voices heard.
Right, and so you're the senior advisor for international education for USAID, and how does that work towards helping girls' education? And like, what does your program do?
Well, we are representative of the U.S. government, and so we're trying to end extreme poverty, obviously. But we work through education, and we focus on access for those who don't have it, and that is primarily girls in the world. So, for instance, in Afghanistan, right now, in the last 10 years, we've made sure that 8 million additional children have access to school, and 40% of those are girls. So when I was in Afghanistan last October, I had the opportunity to speak to some high school girls in a school. It was a community school, and little girls were going to school there, high school girls were going to school there, and you know that nobody can take that education away from them. So if we teach them to read and give them an education, they will change Afghanistan. And right now USAID also is investing in also in scholarships, so that when girls do get an opportunity to go to school, that they also have an opportunity to get higher education so that they can become doctors and lawyers and teachers.
And how do those girls who get a higher education bring it back to their communities?
Well, I think a perfect example in Afghanistan is a woman, Ms. Abbasi. She is going to law school, has become a lawyer, and is is the first Afghan woman to serve as a moot court judge in the international competition. So it doesn't matter, you know, our country, the United States, was a developing country not that long ago. So when I read about Ms. Abbasi, I think of Belbad Mansfield from my own small town in Iowa, who was the first woman admitted to the bar in the United States. So having those firsts are really important, because then those women serve as role models for young women who are 13 years old or 23 years old. So it's important to have role models, and we need to give women the opportunity to get an education. And probably most important is that we create more women teachers, because we can't get more girls in school in many of the countries that I visited and where USAID is working. We can't get more girls in school if we don't have more women teachers. So not having enough women teachers is a barrier.
Okay. Great, thank you. I'd also like to hear Emily's thoughts on this, if you'd like to introduce yourself and then tell us a little bit about what Because I Am a Girl's campaign is like.
Sure, hi, thanks very much for having me today. So my name's Emily Laurie, and I'm the Global Advocacy Manager for the Because I'm a Girl campaign at Plan. We run this campaign across our 70 offices, and we launched a couple of years ago on the first International Day of the Girl. And over 4 years, we're aiming to get 400 million girls and boys, or to indirectly affect or benefit 400 million girls and boys, but with a real focus on girls and girls' education. So yeah, we work across these 70 countries, and we do a range of advocacy and campaigning work around education, and not just on access to education, but really, you know, on what girls are learning whilst they're in school, and making sure that what they're learning is beneficial for their futures. And we also do program work across all of our countries as well. So we have around 259 at the moment girls' education specific programs that we run to actually directly program for girls and for girls' education. We take a similar approach to a range of the other the others that have already spoken, we focus a lot on certain barriers to girls' education. So we do a lot of work, similarly to A World of School, on ending child marriage. We also do a lot of work on ending gender-based violence in and around schools. And we work a lot, obviously, like Girl Up and everyone else on this call, with young people themselves. So we sort of have youth ambassadors and girl ambassadors around the world, and we always say that we work with and for girls on the campaign. So we really develop the campaign with them and really sort of work to ensure that young people themselves are empowered to be advocating for their right to education.
Speaking about young people, how do you think that youth can get involved in becoming advocates for girls' education?
Well, there is a lot of ways. We do a lot of our youth advocacy work on the campaign actually in close partnership with A World at School. And one of the things that we've done together over the last sort of 6 months or so is develop a youth advocacy toolkit. Actually, I should have a copy of it. But we developed it with A World at School and UNICEF, and also with the youth advocacy group for the Global Education First initiative. And there's a group of us that are going to continue to keep disseminating this toolkit. And one of the things we're doing is we're running in-country training sessions on this. So if you get in touch with the Because I'm a Girl campaign or A World at School or the Youth Advocacy Group for Education First, all around the world, young people can find out about how to engage with this. And certainly just this week, we've been running training sessions specifically for young people and how they can advocate on education. We've run sessions in Burundi and Kenya last week, again with the same partners, and Women Thrive and some others. So there's a lot going on at the moment, and there's a lot of momentum around this. And I think, yeah, there's a range of ways especially through some of the organisations on this call. So do get involved. I know we would love to hear from all young people, and I'm sure A World of School and others would as well.
Okay. Sarah had to leave the call, so we have Colleen from A World at School, who's going to be continuing answering the questions for A World at School. And I was wondering what input you had, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and then if you have any input about adding to the conversation about how youth can get involved.
Sure. I'm Colleen Beauchesne. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy for A World at School and the Director of Policy and Research for the Global Business Coalition for Education. First, to apologize in Sarah leaving and you getting me as a substitute. You're not getting the very, very best that we have to offer, but I hope I can pass on the kind of wisdom that she would pass on. You know, it's interesting. I'm getting asked this question a lot more often, more and more, about how youth can get involved than I used to get asked this question, and I think that in itself is a very exciting thing. At A World at School, we have a league of global youth ambassadors. We now have about 500 youth ambassadors from more than 80 countries. And these are people who are working in their communities on education. So they're working at a local, they're working at a national, and together they're working at a global level to push for universal education. I think, so I would encourage people to find out about the program. But what I would say about it is, if you'd asked me a few months ago, before we launched in April, what this program was going to be, I would have probably had a more moderate view of what we were going to be able to ask these youth to do. But we've given them simple things like the youth toolkit, and they've sort of taken it off, translated it to do events that have kind of astounded, come out with materials. They're sending us photos of actions that they've taken and things that they've done. That, you know, we at A World at School, at Plan, we didn't say, now do this. They basically just kind of really stepped forward in an exciting way. And so what I would say to youth about getting involved is do the thing that you think needs to happen in your community. All politics is local, so the toolkit will walk you through some of that. But we are learning I'm learning a tremendous amount from what youth are doing, using that toolkit and just being a youth ambassador and kind of taking that banner forward.
All right, great, thank you. And Christy, what do you think that youth can do to get involved, just furthering the discussion about that, because it's so important?
What Colleen said. Oh, go ahead. What Colleen said is absolutely true. That all politics is local, and young women can get involved in their own communities and their own schools. If they'd like, USAID has a new campaign. It's a public awareness campaign called Let Girls Learn, and if you do hashtag Let Girls Learn, you can go take a look at what's available there. We are partnering with a lot of other organizations all over the world. We can't do this alone, and some of you are right here with us, some of our partners. But Let Girls Learn really got started with 20 to 30 celebrities who were really moved by Malala and the capture of the Nigerian girls and wanted to take action themselves. And it's a great way to really reach out to people all over our country and around the world, people who may never have thought about girls' education and the barriers to girls' education, and to start asking them to get involved. And if you go to that website, you get a chance to look at all of the partners, ways that you could get involved for 10 minutes or half an hour, or if you have a week or the rest of your life to spend on this issue. So I hope that those who are listening and watching today will get involved in whatever way you can. But Let Girls Learn is one way to do it, and educating girls has a ripple effect, and that's what we're trying to do with Let Girls Learn.
Yeah. I'm from Girl Up, which is the United Nations Foundation campaign to support girls in the developing world in a comprehensive way by making sure that they're educated, safe, healthy, counted, and positioned to be the next generation of leaders. And so for the past year, I've served with 19 other girls on a panel of teen advisors that work to really lead the campaign and raise funds and awareness for Girl Up and its mission. So that's another way that I've had the experience of being involved with girls' education. And really, I've noticed that by getting a group of my friends together and working to raise awareness for girls' education, that girls here have become better leaders. All of the girls who've been really involved in leading events and becoming advocates for girls' education, I've seen them become leaders in their own way. So it's really great because I feel like it benefits girls and any youth who really want to get involved, as well as the contributions that they make. And so, Christy, I was wondering, what do you think that we should look at in the post-2015 agenda now that Millennium Development Goals are coming to a close? What should we do now?
Well, I think Sarah mentioned earlier that we still have 500 days, and we need to make sure that we're working to get those children who are not yet in school, and those who have had to drop out to get back in. So we've got a lot of work to do in the next 500 days, and that's about access. And at USAID, we've worked really hard on access, really focusing on countries that are in conflict and crisis. But just making sure that children around the world know how to read is really important, and that's a focus of ours too. So learning, as we move forward, we not only need to get children in school, but we have to convince their parents that they're actually learning something once they get there, because why would you want your child to go to school when they could be working in the fields or helping at home if you don't think they're learning? So we need to take advantage of all of the work that we do with civil society, and we need to be able to produce the statistics, the results that can prove to ministers that they need to invest locally in education and to make sure that girls get a chance to learn.
And making sure that girls have parents and communities that really support their education makes a difference in how far they're able to get an education with. So I was wondering, Emily, so what do you think we should do now that we're approaching a post-2015 agenda?
Sure. I mean, I would 100% agree with what's been said around, not jumping ahead too quickly and really focusing on acceleration and trying to meet the goals we've already set. I think that is really, really important. But I think, in terms of looking forward and what we would like to see, I think one of the key things is obviously it moving beyond primary to include secondary education. Our campaign actually focuses a lot on sort of helping girls transition from primary to secondary, because despite the great success that we've seen with MDG2, there's been very clear evidence to show that when girls sort of hit puberty and adolescence, that's quite often when they really start to drop out because of issues like child marriage. And so it's really important that the next education goal includes kind of secondary as well as primary. We are taking a very sort of having a really big focus on the importance of equity and inclusion with the next education goal, to really make sure, again, despite the great successes, those that are most hardest to reach, they've really been left behind during the last sort of 15 years, and so we really need to focus on them. And one of the other things that I would say is really important is that we are doing a lot of work, not just on the education goal, but the post-2015 framework in general, around the role of young people themselves as being participants in developing the new framework, and then being, playing an advocacy role and really holding governments to account. And so with this conversation, again, I'd say it's really important to make sure that young people are a part of it. And that with any education goal, that it does specifically address barriers that affect girls worse, like child marriage and gender-based violence. So those are a few things that we're looking at.
Okay, definitely agree with what you said, because girls really need to have their education. Making sure that we continue keeping this a priority is so important. Colleen, do you have anything to add to what Emily just said?
I think I just second and third the finish the job message that's here. I think, the post-2015 agenda is really exciting because what we've learned from making these commitments is that we'll actually accelerate, and we've made tremendous progress in health and education. But I actually think that what we are focusing on today and over the next 500 days, and what all the groups on this call are more than well aware of, is actually that looking forward before actually finishing the job is actually misses the point. What I would say actually to youth advocates and those who are on the chat today is that, one of the best things you could do to make yourself an even better advocate is have a look at one of these barriers that's been mentioned. Have a look at child marriage. Have a look at education in emergencies. Have a look at child labor. Have a look at what's happening with teachers. What's happening with the learning crisis. Christy mentioned that, kids need to learn to read. We have hundreds of thousands of children who are in school who aren't getting a quality education, who are not learning to read. So having a look at some of these barriers and figuring out how you, in your community, or through being a spokesperson, or through kind of raising the level of your expertise, can speak on one of these barriers and make yourself an even better advocate. And then even looking at specifically in that barrier, what's in the post-2015 framework? How are we going to finish the job on that barrier, and how are we actually going to make sure that we kind of maintain momentum in the future? I think that would be a really important thing for people to consider if they're thinking about both 2015, finishing the job, as well as what needs to happen next.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like education is very interdisciplinary goal, that it's very related to some of the other goals of the 2015 Millennium Development Goals, such as the maternal health goal and the gender inequality, ending gender inequality goal. And so how do you think that other goals of the post-2015 agenda could tie back into education?
Well, Sarah does, Sarah's been a long-time advocate for child and maternal health, Sarah Brown, and she draws a very good narrative between health and education and makes a very clear point that you're actually not even going to achieve the health MDGs if you don't also focus on education. And what we really need is a convergence between health and education that recognizes, like these and other groups, other leading partners do, that in order to achieve those health goals, you have to get girls in school, that the child mortality goes down, that maternal mortality goes down, that children have healthier outcomes, that families are smaller and healthier if you focus as well on education. So I actually feel like that kind of convergence between health and education, that conversation that's sort of bubbling up more and more, is going to be a very big, important piece of both finishing the first post for the 2015 agenda and post-2015.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Christy, do you think, how do you think that education ties in with some of the other goals?
Well, let me go a little further with Colleen. I think several things. I think oftentimes we concentrate on the numbers, and back to the point of what young people can do is, I think sometimes storytelling is overlooked, and if those youth advocates out there can certainly focus on an issue like one of the barriers, but also focus on a particular story that might show that. So I met a little girl in Malawi whose name was Martha, and she was in first grade, and she was just beginning to learn to read. And I asked one of the people with me who had grown up in that area how her life would be different if and when she learns to read. And he said, first of all, she's going to be a better farmer because she can learn to read. She'll pay attention to the information. Second of all, she will be a healthier woman herself. She will probably space her children and have fewer of them, so she will be healthier. She will be a leader in her community because she'll be communicating with other women in the community. She will make sure her own daughters get an education. So I think across many of the goals, the education is a keystone, because if a girl learns to read, gets an education, continues on, that truly letting girls learn will happen. But sometimes if we can connect the statistics that we talk about so often with an actual person, and I know that Martha has followed me as I've talked about this issue around the country and around the world, because it helps put a human face. And I like to imagine what Martha will be like in her community someday, and how her community and her country will be different because we've all worked together to help educate her.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just the numbers that are powerful and the statistics, it's the stories about real girls and what they're going through.
I also, I met a girl in Honduras a few weeks ago named Nina, and she was a peer teacher. So she was 12 years old, and she'd been a peer teacher for 5 years, and her goal was to become a professional teacher someday. And she had such command of the classroom that, having been a teacher for over 40 years, I was admiring her ability in the classroom to work with children much younger than she was. But it's young women like her who will really be role models and will be advocates not only in this country, but young women who are empowering themselves around the world so that they can help teach other people as well.
That's a great story. Thank you for sharing that with us. I was wondering, Emily, how do you think that the commitment to girls' education will tie into the other goals in the post-2015 agenda?
Sure, and I would totally agree with what the other two panelists have already said, and I really like Christy's point about telling stories rather than talking about numbers, and how, so often even with child marriage and education, you really have two separate groups of people talking about these things. But when you meet, obviously, young people, you realize how these are not separate issues. And a few months ago, we did this youth takeover of the African Union to really focus on education and specifically investing in education. And there was this incredible young girl there called Sata from Liberia, and she'd been married off when she was about 13 years old, and had been treated very violently by her husband, and had a young daughter, and then for a range of reasons had managed to kind of run away from him a couple of years later, and was welcomed luckily back into her family and her community. And now she is one of the most incredible advocates I've ever met, to end child marriage, to talk about violence against women, and talking about the importance of education, because these three things she's just experienced in her life as, the same things. They've all just been part of her life experience. And to me, those kind of, first of all, it shows you how incredibly powerful, again, youth advocates are, and how they can really touch things and move people in a way that I just don't think the rest of us really can. But also how these things are just completely interconnected. And that's why I really want to see young people being part of all the post-2015 discussions, because they really help to break down those silos that maybe the rest of us have kind of worked in for a bit too long. And I just think it is so important. You see it all the time, how education cuts across all the other goals and all the other issues. And but I really like the idea of making those points through stories and through real people, because then I think that's when it sort of comes to life for them.
Yeah, and so the 13-year-old girl in the story that you just mentioned, she was lucky enough to have her family support her when she tried to escape a situation. How do we get parents to support girls who need to escape difficult situations like that?
Sure, and I think and I should have said that obviously she went back to school and then advocates for school, and she was very lucky. But I think that's one of the really important roles that NGOs play in this situation, is obviously the work that ourselves and many other NGOs do with communities and at the community level. And all of our work is sort of community-centered, child-centered community development work. And because you've got to work with the communities, and you've got to work with parents and teachers to get them on board about the importance of girls' education in order to have any change happen. You know, we all do a lot of work advocating at the sort of national level, but none of that means anything. Like the other two have already said, you know, all politics is local. You need to get communities on board with it. So working with local communities, developing champions in local communities, doing awareness raising campaigns in local communities, all of that is, you know, a fundamental part of the solution to get girls into school.
Really great, thank you. Colleen, earlier you had mentioned kind of like the different aspects of getting girls to go back to school, and one of the things you had mentioned was girls in crisis areas, and I know that those are some of the hardest to reach girls. How do we make sure that girls in refugee camps and in crisis areas are able to get an education?
Well, we're currently doing some very dramatic and revolutionary things on this front, but definitely more to be done. So, for example, in Lebanon, following the start of the Syrian crisis, we've implemented a new program of school shifting, and it means that the Lebanese children, the Lebanese government, Lebanese communities have agreed to share their schools with Syrian refugee children. Syrian children go half the day, and Lebanese children go half the day. And the important thing to know about why this matters so much is that prior to the conflict in Syria, 98% of kids were in school. So they had almost achieved Millennium Development Goal 2. Then you have a conflict, you have all of these children thrown into turmoil, and we don't know what's going to happen in Syria. And it's important to understand that in these protracted refugee crises, in conflict, some of these crises can go on for 10, 15, up to 17 years. That's a couple of generations of lost education. One of the things we haven't talked too much about, is just basic poverty. So if a family is already poor, and even if a family is middle class, conflict throws the economy off. It throws everything into crisis. It means a stoppage of services. It means a stoppage of education. How do you then, during conflict or post-conflict, recover? You need education. You need options. When we talk about these barriers, child marriage goes up in a conflict situation because families believe that it's a way to protect their daughters. They believe that someone will look after their daughters. Of course, we know that that's not true, but families with limited amounts of options, families who are literally just struggling to survive, make choices that it's difficult to understand from far away, but are really predicated along a line of a lot of bad options. So education in conflict, the most important thing that we can do is share the message that it is a life-saving intervention. It's a life-saving intervention, and it is the number one way to rebuild communities, to rebuild families, and to give these children who are, thrown into another country, who are traumatized by violence, options to rebuild their lives. It's extremely important.
Especially, it's hard enough getting girls to go to school in the developing world in general, and when you face conflict, whether it's political or whether it's a natural disaster, it adds on to the problems that girls are already facing. Christy, do you have anything to add to how conflict affects girls and how you can make sure that girls still go to school even when they're facing conflict in their area?
Yeah, so we have a program at USAID called Room to Learn, which focuses on countries in conflict and crisis and making sure that children not only have access to school, but they feel safe while they're there. But one of the ways that we have discovered through our research that really works, that I have actually seen working in DRC in the Congo, is accelerated schools. And as a teacher of adolescent girls my whole life, it was great to be able to go to DRC and find out that the brain research has showed us that adolescent brains begin to grow again. And so they can take in more information. And what we've done in DRC, and now we're investing in other countries, is accelerated schools that allow girls who maybe have been in school for a few years and then have had to drop out to come back to school and to finish their primary education in 2 or 3 years instead of 6 years, so that they can go on to secondary education. And we literally, with child soldiers who are boys and with girls who maybe have had to take care of children or work in the fields, they're able to come back to school and complete their primary school education. And because we know we've been able to do the monitoring and evaluation that shows this work, we're able to invest not only in DRC but now in other countries as well with these kinds of schools.
And how does going back to girls who might not have had to gotten their education before and had to grow up without it, how does going back and re-educating them or continuing their education after they've had a long break? How does that transform their lives and their communities?
Well, it transforms their lives, but it also shows their parents that they're actually learning something, and then it provides a model for a community that if this works for some girls and they get a second chance, then maybe other girls will be allowed to come to school as well. And it also, when we monitor and evaluate these programs, we can go to ministers of education, we can go to policymakers at the local level and in our own country and say these are some of the programs that are really working, and we have the results, we have the research to show that they work, and so it's a way to encourage countries and to encourage people in our own country to continue investing in these kinds of programs. So that's why having results and having statistics and doing the monitoring and evaluation part of the programs that we do is especially important, because it builds support at the local level and at the national level as well.
Emily, do you have anything to add about the problems that girls are facing in conflict-ridden areas and how they can still get an education?
I think actually the other two I think have covered the conflict stuff really well. What we actually work on a little bit more with Because I'm a Girl is actually sort of gender-based violence in and around schools, which is not an issue that actually is looked at that much by the education community, I don't think, but we found done a lot of research on this and sort of the impact so girls experience a lot of violence, or certainly the threat of violence on the way to school in many countries. When they're at school, there's this phenomenon that everyone talks about a lot, sex for grades, and kind of the violence that they can experience from teachers whilst they're in schools, and that doesn't just affect them, how long they stay in school, but obviously dramatically affects what they're learning and their own self-esteem and a range of other issues. So we actually, when we talk about violence, we talk and focus a lot about ending gender-based violence in and around schools. So that is something that we are going to continue to work on a lot, and our partners at the UN Girls Education Initiative and Education International, I know it's something that they're both starting to look at a lot more as well, and hopefully we should have some exciting work coming out with them sort of later this year. So that is something the others kind of cover the conflict stuff really well, but I would sort of encourage everyone when thinking about violence to also sort of look at the angle of sort of the individual kind of violence that girls experience in and around schools.
So you guys,
Sorry.
Emily, you do a lot of work on helping to prevent gender-based violence, and I know we've done a lot of talking about the grassroots efforts for girls' education and how working in their own communities can help. But how on the national scale, on the political scale, what kind of legislation can we put in place to make sure that girls don't experience gender-based violence, and what other legislation we can put in place just to protect girls in general?
Sure. Actually, if one of my colleagues is following online, they can share. We developed a national legislation framework for ending gender-based violence in and around schools, which we kind of developed over a sort of 1.5 year period, which sets out really nicely a range of things that would kind of create really good legislation, which kind of ranges from better legislation around corporal punishment and things like that, to sort of new legislation to get sort of funding into buses to schools. There's sort of a range of different things, and we similarly developed a national legislation framework all around ending child marriage as well. And I think one of the things that comes across a lot in all of these sort of legislative frameworks that we look at is all around funding as well, and I just wanted to sort of talk about funding a little bit because it hasn't come up much yet. That you can have the best legislation in the world, but if there's no sort of it's not implemented, and if there's no funding to help implement education frameworks and education sector plans, then you're just not going to get girls into school. And so, I mean, we, like everyone else on the call, worked a lot with the Global Partnership for Education this year, and the new funding that came out of replenishment is 28.2 billion, and they reckon that by 2015, 22% of the girls that are currently out of school will be in school because of that new funding. So I do think it's really important when we have any of these discussions that we have a real focus on funding as well, because obviously at the end of the day, really girls aren't in school a lot of the time because of poverty, and so there needs to be more funding, and funding that targets girls specifically. And just sort of on that, something we're working on a lot with the Global Partnership for Education and some others at the moment is all around encouraging countries to undertake what we call gender reviews of their education sector plans, which is sort of a comprehensive look at their education sector plans and a review of all their legislation and how it might affect girls going into school. And it was piloted in Laos late last year, and we're looking to roll that out across other countries because there's obviously such a range of policy issues and legislative issues that affect girls getting into school and staying in schools. So I think sort of the important thing is to take a very holistic approach to it and to include all these different things.
Yeah, that's really great, Emily. Definitely looking at like the grassroots as well as the like national political side of things is really a comprehensive approach to getting girls back to school. Colleen, do you have anything to add to how legislation and politics can really influence the way that girls are able to go to school?
I would say yes, and Emily made the point that I was, sorry, gagging to make, which is about funding, because what we have is a situation where we've stalled in making progress at getting all kids out of school. Meanwhile, funding over the last couple of years has plummeted, particularly in hard-to-reach areas. Global Partnership for Education is in many of those areas, as Emily mentioned, but one of the places where there's the least amount of funding is in conflict and emergency areas. People don't understand that, in fact, that is an investment to make at that time. I think, you know, and Emily highlighted this, you can't do any of these things separately. You need adequate funding. So countries need to scale up their education budgets to the recommended 20% of GDP. And some years ago, as we kicked off the MDGs, developed countries said no good education plan will go unfunded. It will not be unimplemented for lack of resources. And developed countries who signed on to the MDGs haven't kept that commitment. Some countries have come forward and actually made good, solid commitments. They've been consistent with their funding. They've funded both primary and secondary education. And other countries have sort of looked away, shifted their priorities. So I think what's really important, particularly as we make this final push, as we look at legislation to remove some of these barriers, to remove child marriage, to get it up to 18 in every country, and to make sure that it's enforced, and to make sure that our communities are supported, to have other options, we also have to look at the fact that it's all about the money. This doesn't happen without the funding to get kids in school, and that is everyone's responsibility. And it's pretty clear who's kind of keeping up their end of the bargain. So that'll be something that we'll be pushing on, particularly over the next 500 days.
Really great, thank you. And Christy, do you have any thoughts on how legislation and politics can influence girls' education?
Well, all politics is local, we've said before, and nothing succeeds like success. So I think if you want more funding, we all have to go out and work at the local level, because especially in a democracy like here in the United States, it comes from the ground up. So if citizens want to spend more money on international programs, then we have to convince them that what we're doing is working and that we're working in countries and showing progress and showing results. So, for instance, I think most Americans can understand, because we experience this in our own country, that one of the barriers to education in rural America or rural any place in the world is distance to school. And one of the kinds of programming that has worked in a lot of countries, all of the countries where we're working, seems to be community-based education. If you can put a school closer to the girls, they're going to be able to go to school because they have their parents know that they'll be safe getting there and that it won't be a problem getting them to school. So in Afghanistan, for instance, we started community-based schools in homes and very close in communities, and these were supported by parents, were supported by local people. And so when local people have buy-in, no matter what country it is, they're going to start, if it works and they see that their children are getting educated, they're going to start putting pressure on their political leaders to increase the amount of funding for education. I had the opportunity to sit in a meeting at the United Nations meetings last year where Malala basically said to her own leader in her own country, you know, you're doubling the amount of money for education in this country, but it's still not enough. So I think certainly working at the local level, but not being afraid to speak to policymakers and people who have that power no matter where you live or what age you are or what your social situation is, that we have to make sure that we speak to the people who have the opportunity to make policy and ask them for more.
Great. And Christy, so I mean, there's definitely like the grassroots and community side, but then there's also the politics and policy and legislation side of things. But I think there's kind of like a third tier with social media advocacy. I know that especially with what happened with the girls in Nigeria and hashtag like bring back our girls. Well, social media has been a really great way to campaign for girls' education, and I've seen, like, I've been getting a lot of tweets already about this panel right now. So how do you think that social media can impact girls' education?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. I think this chat we're having is a perfect example. But USAID is also partnering with Girl Rising, and probably everybody who's listening has seen some of Girl Rising, some of the episodes of these wonderful young girls who are overcoming barriers to get an education. But we're now moving one step further with Girl Rising and working on this public awareness campaign in India and in DRC and Nigeria also, to make sure that we build awareness. And I think it's a perfect example of using technology, using media to engage the grassroots and to help people understand at the local level and to really engage with the stories of real girls who are overcoming these barriers. And I think one thing we haven't mentioned is how important it is when we're talking about girls' education that we involve men, because this isn't just about girls and women, it's about men. And if you watch Girl Rising as Mara from India and the little girl, there are several the girl from Ethiopia whose brother really helps her get an education, and the little girl whose father stands by her to get an education. It's really, really important that we don't forget in these conversations that it's really important that we involve men and boys in this conversation, because oftentimes they can be a huge help in making sure that girls get an education.
And Girl Rising definitely reflects back to what you said earlier about it's really the stories that are so powerful. Students at my school did a screening of Girl Rising to raise awareness and raise funds for Girl Up and what we were doing, and I think it was really what got most people involved. Seeing the movie and hearing the story was really it's really startling how amazing it is. Just seeing the girls really changes people's perspectives.
And also there's a curriculum that goes along with Girl Rising as well for upper elementary, for middle school and high school. So that's another way for young people in the audience today or teachers who might be listening. It's a wonderful opportunity to bring this conversation right into schools and get people talking about it. And I truly believe that if we have people all over the country, if people in service organizations and church basements and middle school kids and high school kids all over the country had an opportunity to see movies like Girl Rising, or even one segment of it, that it would touch them in a way that would help them think that this is important.
And I feel like learning about the struggles that girls have around the world getting an education really makes students value their own education. I remember students came up to me after the film saying how lucky they were to get to go to school here, and I think that was really powerful. But so we're going to start wrapping up. We have one last question. I think we'll start with Emily. What would our world be like if more women and girls were empowered through education?
That's a big question. Can I just say much better? I think, it's hard when you believe so much in the power of girls' education to try to sum up for how much better I think the world would be. I just think there isn't one aspect of the world that wouldn't benefit. I think it's important when we talk about this. Quite often there's kind of a weird pressure that's put on girls, sort of educate a girl, empower the world kind of thing, like it's their responsibility somehow. And I think we need to remember fundamentally that every girl has the right to an education, and that's the most important thing here. Is that I'll come on to all the things that would be better, I think, if girls had an education, but fundamentally it would be better for the girls themselves, and every girl has the right to an education, and that's why we're doing this. I think when you're advocating and campaigning around this issue, clearly the arguments about all the incredible other benefits we have are very critical to kind of making the case to get other people on board with this. And I mean, there's a range of things, obviously a lot of the data it shows around how that would reduce poverty is fundamentally critical. The health impacts would be absolutely massive, I think what is the stat around if girls had a secondary school in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, child marriage would reduce by something like 65% around the whole world, So I think the sort of child protection and violence issues would be incredible. The health impacts would be incredible. Poverty reduction would be incredible. And yeah, just the girls themselves would have more of an opportunity to kind of fulfill their own individual potential, which for me and for our campaign is really what it's all about.
Great, thank you. Colleen, do you have, what do you think the world would look like if more girls and women were empowered through education?
UN Special Envoy for Global Education, Gordon Brown, calls the struggle to get all girls, all children everywhere in school a civil rights struggle, the next big civil rights struggle. I don't think he's wrong. I think we're talking about girls are out of school many of the times because they're girls. We're talking about human rights. We're talking about essentially a revolution. When we do this, I think that there are going to be so many good unintended consequences that we're going to be overwhelmed by our own accomplishment. It's true that we will see maternal mortality go down. It's true that we will see many less children dying of unnecessary causes. It's true that we will see economies grow and prosper. It's true that we will see, actually, an end to poverty. And so I don't think there's any way to say it that doesn't sound really extreme, but that isn't also true. It's basically going to change the world. It's one of the most important things we can do, and it's linked to all of the, we set these MDGs because we thought we want a different world, and getting all girls in school everywhere is how we're going to get that world.
Great, thank you. And Christy, what do you think our world would look like if girls and women were empowered through education?
When you let girls learn, it has a ripple effect. The world will be more prosperous, and the world will be a safer place to live, and that's what's most important.
Really great. Thank you. Do you guys have any final thoughts?
I would say one last thing to the social media point, which is that our digital advocacy base is one of the most important ways that we're doing this. So you're watching this right now, you're part of that. You're part of people who are trying to connect across countries. I know I saw a tweet, someone's in Mozambique. Someone's in Saudi Arabia. People are all over the place tweeting and talking and emailing and connecting. And I think, there's sometimes criticisms about, are we becoming less connected or more connected? We do something like this, and we talk about supporting people we don't even know, we might not even meet, we're definitely becoming more connected. It's hugely important. So thanks everyone for joining.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that as well, to say that I completely agree, and I think there's this weird pressure on social media to somehow be, something that it's not. It's a really part of the solution, and it's an incredible part of the solution. It's just part of it, like all parts of campaigning, you've got to do it all to make it work, but it's a really important part of it. And I also think we've seen a lot the importance, obviously, of text messaging and SMSing as well. And we've had sort of national texting campaigns in Ethiopia and a range of other countries around the Day of the Girl specifically, which has had a massive impact as well. So all of these things, are just part of the solution. And the final thing I want to say is to welcome and totally agree with what Christy said about the role of men and boys as well. Certainly with a campaign called Because I'm a Girl, we get a lot of questions about men and boys, and of course we work 100% with men and boys, and they are, just as much part of the solution as girls and women, and certainly some of the world's best girls advocates and girl champions I know are men and boys. And I met this incredible 70-year-old boy in Bangladesh last year who runs these child marriage, they're called the Wedding Busters. He goes around with other young people in his community, and with the support of the local community, sort of confronts parents that he's found out are meant to be marrying off these girls. And and he to me is the exemplar of what an incredible male advocate can be doing, and he's really the biggest girls education champion I know almost. So I just welcome that and say that we completely agree with that.
All right. Great, thank you. Do you have any final thoughts too, Christy?
No, I just think it's really important. I appreciate having the opportunity to have this conversation with all of you, and I think it's important that we all stay connected because this is about partnership. No one of us, no one organization can do this alone, and that's really the power of social media and the media generally, that we can stay connected no matter who we are or where we are.
Great. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you from all of us at Girl Up. We're so happy that we were able to hear from all of you, very inspired and ready to go get out there and get ready for the last 500 days and the post-2015 agenda. So thank you all. Thank you all of us from Girl Up. I'm so glad to have you all, and thank you to everyone who's watching. So really great.
Thanks for hosting us.
Yeah, thanks.